Welcome to The Explainer. Today we are cracking open a dossier on one of the absolute oldest, strangest, and honestly most intriguing accounts in human history. We're investigating a genuine historical enigma, the mysteries of the Nephilim, those ancient giants that once walked the earth according to biblical records. Throughout this analysis, we aren't just going to look at myths and legends, we're going to dissect specific details straight from the source texts to truly understand the scale, the origins, and the story behind these incredibly anomalous figures.
Okay, let's dive into this. The absolute core question that has completely baffled scholars, theologians, and history buffs for centuries is simply this: where did the Nephilim actually come from? Ancient texts suggest there was an entire era dominated by these colossal entities. But to truly understand who they were, we have to rewind the clock and follow the chronological breadcrumbs left behind in these ancient manuscripts.
Section 1. The Era of Beginnings.
So let's map this out. We start way back on day 6, which the texts mark as the creation of humanity. Then we jump forward across the devastating Great Flood, a massive, literal watershed dividing line in the ancient world. And finally, we land in the post-flood era with the generation of the Tower of Babel. These giants and tyrants, they didn't just pop up out of a vacuum. They emerged from the sheer chaos of these exact historical turning points.
And coming out of that historical backdrop, our sources present a pretty bold theory. There are distinct arguments suggesting that the records of these giants, these bloodthirsty tyrants roaming the early Earth, have been deliberately veiled in secrecy. Some sources even claim this knowledge has been intentionally hidden by the Church. So, this early period, it wasn't just some peaceful ancient pastoral scene. It was a highly volatile staging ground for the overarching mystery of a completely megalomaniacal generation.
Section 2. Nimrod and the Tower of Babel.
Now, what's really interesting about this is how the historical documents frame Nimrod. He wasn't just your run-of-the-mill ancient king. The source material defines him with a very specific, heavy title, the first tyrant. He openly defied God and was the architect behind the Tower of Babel. This is a huge shift in post-flood human history. Power is suddenly centralized into the hands of one incredibly ambitious individual, which perfectly mirrors the whole tyrannical nature of the Nephilim.
Let's walk through the precise steps these early people took, straight from the original texts. Step 1. They moved east and settled in the plain of Shinar. Step 2. They kicked off a literal construction revolution. They swapped out stone for baked brick and used bitumen for mortar. And Step 3, the ultimate goal, build a massive city and a tower reaching all the way to the sky. Sure, it was a physical monument made of brick and tar, but functionally, it was a colossal monument to human pride and absolute power.
Well, that ambition to reach the heavens was abruptly halted. The Great Rebellion under Nimrod was totally interrupted. The records say God scattered the builders across the earth and completely confused their language so they literally couldn't understand each other anymore. With communication completely severed, this massive project just ground to a dead halt. The people scattered, and the city was named Babel, a name that literally means confusion.
Section 3. The Giant Goliath.
And this brilliantly illustrates the terrifying physical reality of these beings. Just think about the data pulled directly from the text. Goliath of Gath stood roughly 3 meters tall. Think about that for a second. That's almost 10 feet. The bronze scale armor he wore weighed 50 kilograms. His iron spearhead alone weighed 6 kilograms. These aren't just flowery, poetic descriptions. This maps out a colossal, walking war machine, a living embodiment of the legacy of these massive ancient beings.
Now, just imagine the ratios on the battlefield. On one side, you have Goliath, a terrifying, heavily armored giant representing absolute peak physical power and the absolute best weaponry the Philistines had to offer. On the other side, David, a young, relatively small shepherd with no armor, no sword, stepping onto the battlefield armed with literally nothing but a simple sling and a stone. This incredibly stark contrast really highlights the impossible stakes here. By any normal logic, a regular human had absolutely zero chance of winning.
Yet standing right in front of this colossal enemy, David utters a phrase that completely flips the psychology of the battle. He boldly declares, "The battle is the Lord's." He's basically pointing out that victory wouldn't be decided by swords or armor or sheer physical size, but by a higher power. This single declaration takes the whole narrative to its emotional peak, totally transforming a physical mismatch into a sheer battle of faith.
What happens next unfolds with absolutely lightning speed. The text records exactly how it went down. David didn't hesitate for a second.
He ran straight to the battle line. He slung a stone with devastating force, sinking it deep into the giant's forehead, making him collapse face first into the dirt. And finally, since he didn't even have a sword of his own, David runs over, draws Goliath's own massive sword from its sheath, and severs his head. An incredibly swift, shocking end that firmly closed the book on one of history's most infamous giants.
Let's move to and see how this builds into Section 4, the hidden secrets.
So, the crucial point is this. Based on the materials we've reviewed, there's a very strong argument being made that the legacy of these beings has never been fully brought to light. The true existence of the Nephilim, their ancient bloodlines, and how they supposedly ruled the early Earth, it's allegedly a carefully guarded secret. Whether you approach this from a historical, theological, or purely mystical perspective, the sources we're looking at all agree on one thing. There is a massive, glaring gap in how mainstream history tells the story of these titans.
Which leaves us with one massive question to ponder today. What is the true legacy of these ancient giants? Were they simply physical anomalies, rare genetic outliers like Goliath? Or did they represent an entirely different, early, hybridized generation? From Nimrod's incredibly arrogant tower to the cracking sound of a single stone hitting Goliath's skull, their footprints are stamped all over ancient texts. Could it be that the history we think we know is still full of locked doors and hidden files? Keep pondering these Nephilim mysteries, and we'll see you in our next explainer.
Welcome back, Focus Learners, to another explainer. Today, we're cracking open what is essentially an ancient cold case file. We aren't just skimming through your standard everyday history textbook here. No, we're digging into some of the absolute oldest texts and records we have, which speak of something completely anomalous. We're talking about Nephilim, the enigmatic, legendary giants of the ancient world. So let's jump right in and unravel this mystery together. You really have to ask yourself, what exactly is ancient history hiding about the earliest days of humanity? And what is the true nature of these biblical giants? For centuries, people have debated whether these early accounts are just purely symbolic myths, or if they contain the scattered and frankly terrifying remnants of a forgotten reality. Section 1, the ancient giants. Let's get right into it. If you look across various ancient texts, from the Middle East all the way to the Mediterranean, you're going to find this persistent, recurring theme. Stories of giant beings who possessed just immense physical strength and completely dominated the early human landscape. But who or what were the Nephilim? Well, the ancient biblical texts describe them as these mysterious, enigmatic entities. These were powerful, literal giants who walked the earth right alongside early humanity. The texts absolutely do not present them as abstract spiritual metaphors. They're described as physical, tangible beings of extraordinary size that left a massive, highly disruptive footprint on the ancient world. Moving on to Section 2, Origin of the Nephilim. So, if these were physical beings actually walking the earth, where in the world did they come from? What's really fascinating is that the ancient texts give us a few prevailing and, honestly, wildly different origin theories. Were they the offspring of fallen angels and human women? Or maybe they were the descendants of corrupted ancient bloodlines. Some other sources suggest they might have simply been earthly tyrants, men of massive physical stature and intense rebellion who just became mythologized over thousands of years. The sources don't take a definitive theological side, but they all agree these beings were a massive disruption to the natural order. Which brings us to Section 3, the hidden secrets. Now, you might be wondering, if the Nephilim truly existed and shaped the early history of mankind, why isn't this front and center in our standard history classes? How have modern and historical institutions handled these bizarre records? Well, some analyses explore a pretty bold investigative claim: the Nephilim and the secret hidden by the church. The idea here is that over the centuries, various religious and historical institutions might have actively downplayed or obscured the reality of these giants. Why? Potentially to protect a more orthodox, streamlined narrative of human history. It's a fascinating perspective on how institutional control can totally dictate what parts of ancient history we remember and what parts we're quietly encouraged to forget. Section 4, Judgment, the Great Flood. Okay, so the ancient texts don't let the Nephilim rule forever. Eventually, the narrative builds to a catastrophic, world-altering purge. Looking at the chronology of these giants, it brilliantly illustrates thousands of years of history. We start off in the pre-flood era, which is all about the rise and dominance of the Nephilim. Then, boom, we hit the Great Flood, this massive event of divine judgment and planetary purge. But pay close attention to that third era, the post-flood era, the survival and reemergence of giants. That is where the plot thickens considerably. In these ancient texts, the Great Flood is framed as way more than just a really bad natural disaster. It's described as a shocking, catastrophic, divine response. Its specific purpose, according to these interpretations, was to serve as the ultimate cosmic reset button. It was designed to completely purge the Earth of this violent, anomalous, giant bloodline that had basically corrupted everything. And that leads us right into Section 5, Post-Flood Traces. So here is where we hit a huge historical contradiction. If the Great Flood was this ultimate reset button designed to wipe the Nephilim out entirely, how on earth do we still have highly detailed, specific records of giants showing up later in history? Just look at the historical text of David and Goliath. It is the absolute ultimate mismatch. On one side, you have David, armed with nothing but a simple sling and a smooth stone. On the other side, the giant Goliath. And the texts are incredibly specific here. We are talking about a warrior who is roughly 3 meters tall, that's nearly 10 feet, wearing 50 kilograms of scale armor. Those exact textual measurements really highlight the sheer terror of facing a post-flood giant. This wasn't just a tall guy. This was a living remnant of an ancient, terrifying world. 6 kilograms. Just let that sink in for a second. According to the ancient records, that was the weight of just the iron spearhead on Goliath's weapon. Think about the immense, ridiculous physical strength it would take to casually wield a weapon with a 6-kilogram piece of solid iron right at the tip. It's granular, specific details exactly like this that ground the whole myth in an absolute terrifying reality. Let's actually break down the full arsenal of this giant. A heavy bronze helmet on his head, 50 kilograms of bronze scale armor covering his body, bronze greaves protecting his legs, a massive bronze javelin slung between his shoulders, and, of course, that 6-kilogram iron spearhead we just talked about. This description paints such a vivid, cinematic picture of his overwhelming physical advantage. It shows us exactly what early humanity was up against when they encountered the stragglers of this bloodline. But here's the crazy part. Despite all of that, despite his overwhelming size, his terrifying strength, and lugging around 50 kilograms of armor, the giant Goliath is ultimately felled by a single, perfectly placed stone from a shepherd's sling. It's a dramatic, almost unbelievable conclusion to this specific encounter, the triumph of a regular human over a seemingly invincible ancient anomaly. So, the crucial question we're left with as we wrap up today's explainer is this. Did the bloodline of the Nephilim truly end in the dirt of that valley with Goliath? Or is history still hiding pieces of this ancient puzzle? Think back to those hidden secrets we talked about earlier. It really leaves you wondering what else ancient history might be concealing from us, just waiting to be uncovered in those old texts. Thank you so much for joining me today, focused learners. Keep questioning, keep analyzing, and I'll catch you in the next explainer.